All right, joining me now here on the Chase Thomas podcast, taping this on a Tuesday afternoon. First timer, Tony Morrell is here of the Big Spur. Tony, good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great, Chase. How about you?
Not too bad. Not too bad. I mean, I won't, like we were talking before we got on here, Tennessee baseball not hosting Southern Miss this weekend in the Super Regional. Not really thrilled about that. JJ Harrell decommits from Tennessee football this week, 4-star wide receiver out of Mississippi. Cam Fountain ends up at USC kind of out of nowhere. So the sky is falling a little bit right now here on Rocky Top. So it's actually kind of a more chaotic week than I had anticipated it being here on Knoxville. But I assume things are pretty good over there in South Carolina country. Baseball going well, recruiting going well. Y'all aren't feeling it this week the same way we are.
Yeah, maybe not quite to that degree. South Carolina was involved with Cam Fountain as well. And, was one of his lead schools at one time. But I think, Gamecock fans had already realized that he was probably headed elsewhere. So it wasn't as big a shock maybe as it was to Tennessee when he made that commitment to Southern Cal. But they're certainly throwing the NIL money around out there in LA and making recruiting a big part of it. So it's going to be interesting to see how Lincoln Riley can manage all that and whether he can keep his locker room happy.
Absolutely. Well, there is one outside of Fountain that I wanted to pick your brain on that Tennessee and South Carolina both seem to be in a strong running for it. It's running back Daniel Hill. Do you think he is a lean for South Carolina at the moment? Where do you think Daniel Hill is at this point in time?
I do think he's a South Carolina lean. I think he has been for a while. He's going to visit South Carolina the weekend of June 23rd, which is their big official visit weekend this month. They're going to have just about all of their current commitments visiting that weekend. And then some of their top targets like Daniel Hill, Dylan Stewart, Jordan Thomas, 4-star defensive tackle out of New Jersey. They're going to have several of those types on campus as well. But I do think the Gamecocks are in a good spot with Hill, but obviously they have to close the deal.
It's all about closing the deal now. And I mean, I think Alabama's obviously in there because he's an Alabama kid originally, right? Isn't he? Yeah. So it's going to be a tough one to get the kid out of Alabama, right?
Yeah, it's hard to know where he is on Alabama's board. They obviously have a lot of options at receiver and running back, it seems like every year. But he has visited there and is someone they've offered. But whether or not he's the same priority for Alabama that he is for South Carolina, I'm not sure.
When you look at South Carolina and just gauging where the fan base is at the moment, are South Carolina football fans thinking SEC East dark horse this fall, or are they just like, hey, our schedule's tough, which I'll ask you about a little bit. Like, are they pretty realistic about it, or is there just because you have a lot of recruiting momentum at the moment and because of how last season ended, just about if you exclude the bowl game, which I think most folks really should at this point exclude whatever happens in these bowl games. Beating Clemson and Tennessee the way that they did, is it now like you have to make this jump, or are South Carolina fans pretty measured in like, look, this is where we're at. We have to go to Georgia. We have to go to Tennessee, like 8-4. Let's just let's hope and we'll get closer next year. Or are they thinking dark horse?
No, I think most fans are pretty measured and thinking more along the lines of how you mentioned at the end of that sentence, end of your question. 8-4 would be a very good year and another step forward for Shane Beamer. A lot of positive momentum surrounding the program. I think Beamer is doing a very good job of creating a culture that recruits and players want to be a part of, and is building a foundation for a program that can compete year in and year out. And South Carolina's really never had that. Muschamp was supposed to be that guy, but it just really never materialized under him. Spurrier and Holtz were both savior types who were really more year to year than looking at building something long term. And Beamer is taking a completely different approach. But I think most Gamecock fans know that there's enough questions surrounding their personnel to where winning the SEC East is probably a long shot. Not probably. I mean, it is a long shot. You look at what Georgia's done. You look at what Tennessee has returning, and have to go to both of those places. To win the East, they would have to win at least one of those games on the road, and then really fare well in all of their home games and the rest of their road SEC games, which they also go to A&M. Who knows what to expect from A&M. They could great. They could be, what they were last year. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how that Petrino-Fisher marriage works. But I think most are pretty realistic and would just love to see another step forward. It's probably going to be Spencer Rattler's last year, and there's some weapons, and they should be better offensively and exciting to watch. But, with the schedule they have, particularly the road schedule in conference, it's going to be tough to really be there in the end in the SEC East, I think.
How much do you read into the toughest schedule in college football narrative? Do you think it's fair, or do you think people are overblowing it a little bit?
I think it's a bit overblown. I find it hard to believe that their schedule is the toughest in college football. I don't know what every team, has on their schedule. I haven't looked at it that closely, but I think a lot of it is, based on tradition. You look at the number of teams on South Carolina's schedule that are going to be replacing their quarterback,
Mm,
which I think a lot of times is indicative of what kind of year a team is likely to have. And the majority of the teams on the schedule are going to have a new quarterback. And I think that's a positive for South Carolina, where if they were playing Georgia and Tennessee and these teams and they all had their quarterbacks back, then maybe you could make the argument that it's the toughest schedule in the country. But I think when you look at Florida replacing the quarterback, Tennessee, Georgia, A&M could have a new quarterback. There's a lot of uncertainty, and who knows what to expect from Mississippi State with
yeah.
Mike Leach. Kentucky is going to be replacing their quarterback, but that may actually be an upgrade.
Mm,
We'll see how it plays out, but it's certainly a tough schedule. But it's a tough schedule every year when you play in the SEC, especially the SEC East when you have to face Tennessee, like they are now, and Georgia coming off back-to-back national championships, and that's life in the SEC East. It's just I think the road schedule is what makes it a little bit tougher than last year.
absolutely. What do you think are going to be the biggest differences between what Logan's is going to do? Logan's. I never.
Dallas.
Loggins,
Yeah.
Dow Loggins. What do you think the biggest differences are going to be for Beamer's staff here offensively versus what we've seen the last couple of years with Satterfield?
Well, one thing I don't think you'll see Shane Beamer ever do again is allow his offense to become too complicated, and
Hmm.
that's what happened last year. A lot of people want to know what happened. How did South Carolina play that well offensively against Tennessee and Clemson, and even in the bowl game against Notre Dame versus how they had performed the majority of the year prior to that? And the biggest thing was they simplified everything.
Hmm.
And they reduced their personnel packages down from 21 to 7. They, drastically reduced the number of plays that Marcus Satterfield had to pick from on the sideline on game day. And the players responded, and they knew what they were doing really for the
Hmm.
first time, play in and play out. And that's really what changed. And that's why Spencer Rattler played so much better. He wasn't lost anymore. I think that's the biggest thing Beamer learned under Satterfield, and is not going to allow that to happen again under Loggins. And Loggins obviously saw what happened as well. So I think I think you'll still see a lot of the pro style concepts that Satterfield used, but I think it'll be easier for the players to understand. And I think you'll see more air raid stuff in, the things that he learned under Kendall Briles at Arkansas, and just some of the things he's learned since he returned to college from the NFL. I think he wants to blend those two and really utilize his personnel. I think that was another weakness of Marcus Satterfield was, because he had so many personnel packages, there were just too many instances where his playmakers were standing on the sideline versus out there on the field with a chance to make plays. And I think Loggins is going to do a much better job of building around his playmakers and making sure those guys are on the field as much as possible and being put in a position where they can, use their strengths and make bigger plays.
Just thinking about just a year from now, do you think we'll end up looking at this offensive coordinator change as a net positive for South Carolina?
I do, personally. Obviously there's nobody to know that for sure because Loggins has never done it at the college level, but just based on everything I've heard about how he's integrated himself with the other coaches, what the players think of him, what Beamer thinks of him, what opposing coaches who are familiar with his coaching ability and style think of him, his recruiting ability. Satterfield really recruited quarterbacks, and that was it. Logan recruiting anybody they wanted him to help with, and that's been a nice change for them on the recruiting trail as well. He's making phone calls. He's much more involved when kids are on campus than Satterfield was, and it's just a general more positive attitude around the program on the offensive side of the ball with him in charge, and I think that will pay dividends.
Interesting. Where are they gonna land recruiting wise in the 2024 cycle here? Do you think they land potentially at that 5-6 spot? Do you think it's closer to 9-10? Is it outside the top 10? Based on because they have a lot of dudes in the boat already, right? Like they've got a pretty good amount.
They do. They've lost a little bit of momentum here in the last
Mm,
month or so. They were really. It felt like they were positioned extremely well at just about every position to close out and potentially have a top 5-6 type class when all was said and done. That may be a little bit more difficult with some of the guys they missed out on here recently.
mm,
I think that probably top 10 to 12 range is probably more realistic, but there's still an opportunity for it to be better than that if they can really close the deal on a guy like Dylan Stewart, for instance, who's
mm.
the number one player in the country. I think South Carolina, if not his leader, is at least top 2 with him. But there's a lot of indications behind the scene that they could be the leader. And they've had a lot of success recruiting the DMV area under Beamer, and they have a chance to do that again this year. And he obviously would be the biggest fish up there. But when you're competing with, you look at what Georgia's doing, what Tennessee's doing, what Alabama's doing, Ohio State, just in conference alone, it's tough to finish top 5.
Mm.
To do it nationally is obviously even more difficult when you add in Southern Cal, Ohio State, Texas, and some of these other schools. So, it's top 5's tough for a school like South Carolina, but I do think 10 to 12 is doable if they can close the deal on the right guys down the stretch.
Who do you think your gut's telling you is gonna be the headliner from this class years from now? Who do you think will end up being the best player?
Um, if they land him, I think it could be Dylan Stewart.
Okay.
I think they need a playmaking edge type player, and he obviously fits the bill. Um, has all the tools to be a great pass rusher,
Mm,
very disruptive as a pass rusher, but he's also very coachable and can stop the run. Is not just a guy who goes and gets the quarterback. He's a complete player. And Sterling Lucas, their edge coach, is looking for a guy to build around at that position, and I think he could be that kind of guy. But there's a few different players I think that they're likely to land who could, they're not sexy, but Cam Pringle and Josiah
yeah.
Thompson at offensive tackle are 2 guys that have the look of being future 10-year plus NFL guys if they develop.
Mm,
Expect them to, but a lot of people don't really want to point to an offensive tackle and say he's going to be the best player in this class, but it's possible, and that's not historically how South Carolina has recruited on the offensive line. Getting 2 bookend guys like that to build around for the future, I think, is huge for them. It's going to allow them to move a guy like Marquis Anderson, who they signed last year, inside to guard, where I think he's a better fit,
mm.
and really have 2 prototypical type tackles to build around, and that really is going to help Loggins as he builds on this offense in future years.
Yeah, fans aren't looking at that because as you know, covering recruiting is just there aren't a lot of 5-star offensive tackles. There aren't a lot of those premier guys, and if they are those premier guys, it's really hard to beat out the Bamas of the world for those guys because that pipeline. It's just you look at Proctor. I think was named the Iowa kid, where it was down to Iowa and Bama, and he still chose Bama. And I think it was reported that Iowa offered him more money. It's not just NIL. Like it's really hard to get those guys. Like Tennessee, I tell folks where I'm like, when Tennessee fans get annoyed about the offensive tackle position and where they're recruiting, and I'm like, there aren't a lot of guys around here. Like Cam Pringle, yeah, you can swing at Cam Pringle, but it's just going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard to swing at the Marcus Easley types who I think they're going to get in here in the next month. But like, it seems like that's an Alabama lean. So it's just really hard when Trey Smith is born in your state and is local. That's really nice. But when you
And
don't have that,
that's the situation South Carolina found themselves in
yes.
with Pringle and Thompson, to have those guys in state and
Mm-hmm.
to be able to get them on campus. Thompson in particular attends a school that has sent the majority of their players over the years to South Carolina when they've
Mm-hmm.
had Division I prospects. So they had the ties they needed there. And then they really did a good job with Pringle of just getting him on campus as much as possible to build that
Mm-hmm.
relationship with him, because Clemson felt good about him for a long time early in the process, but they were able to turn him. But if they were recruiting those 2 guys in the state of Georgia or the state of Florida, odds are they're not coming to South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to capitalize when you get those opportunities, and they did.
Absolutely. Speaking of Tennessee and South Carolina, I wonder because it seems like from the outside, like fans obviously love to craft their own narratives and spin their own narratives, but do you think there actually is real animosity between Shane Beamer and Josh Heupel?
I don't think they're going to be sharing a meal anytime soon.
Okay.
Uh, and don't get me wrong, Beamer has not made any comments to me or to anyone that I know of behind the scenes directly about Josh Heupel, but I don't think that either side is particularly fond of the other one, based
Mm,
on what's happened the last couple of years on the field. And you know, Heupel obviously got the best of Beamer 2 years ago, and then Beamer returned the favor this year. And I know Heupel is going to try to get back on the right side of things when South Carolina comes to town. I'm sure they've had that game circled and will continue to have it circled based on what happened last year. But I think it's going to be fun to watch the two of those guys as they build the programs. I think they're going to be competing for a long time. Assuming I don't. I think there's very little chance Beamer leaves South Carolina. That's where he wants to be. He's made it very clear it's his dream job. I don't think Heupel would leave Tennessee either, unless just the NFL maybe came calling or something like that at some point. It was too good to pass up. But odds are they're going to be at their respective programs for a long time, and
mm.
I think they're going to obviously play each other every year right now. Whether that remains under the SEC news format, I don't know, but I think you're going to see them play a lot, and I think both coaches are off to a good start in building their respective programs.
It really does feel like they've become a fun rivalry here. And I mean, the games are obviously more competitive because I think a lot of people just assume Kentucky, Tennessee, but those games aren't really like Tennessee doesn't sweat Kentucky every year. Like they are not sweating going into Kentucky next year. It's just, and there's obviously no love lost there between Stoops and Heupel, dating back to the Oklahoma stuff. So when we talk about animosity, I don't think Heupel has any plans to lose to Mark Stoops anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't think Stoops is any other coach's favorite guy. He has a tendency to rub guys the wrong way, but he's done a heck of a job at a tough place to win.
Mm,
Football's never going to be the priority at Kentucky.
yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see if he ends up moving on at some point and gets an opportunity to really show what he's capable of. But that's a team that South Carolina didn't used to sweat
Mm,
Mark Stoops, and then last year they snapped a long losing streak to Kentucky when they beat them. So
yeah.
um, they need to continue to win that game. I think if they want to have upward mobility in the SEC East, that's a game they have to win as much as possible, obviously. And then Missouri is another team that South Carolina has struggled with a little bit more than people might expect, and they go to Missouri this season, and I think that's another game that they have to start consistently getting the better of.
Yeah, that's another one where I'll just go ahead and say I don't think Heupel has any qualms about dropping 60 at Mizzou this fall. I don't think he's at all concerned about running up the score against Eli and company this year. And it's funny too because I like Napier. You would think Tennessee, Georgia, or Tennessee, Florida, and I'm like I don't think there really is a whole lot of animosity with Heupel and Kirby and Napier. I think it's actually the unusual suspects, the Stoops and the Eli's of the world, and
Yeah,
maybe Beamer. I think Beamer is just more competitive, where I think they enjoy and respect. Like there is some like we'll see what happens with kickoff time, but I want to make a rule where Tennessee's not allowed to play at South Carolina at night. If we're going back every other year or whatever. You can only play at noon or 3:30 on CBS. I'm not doing any more House of Horrors at South Carolina with that place rocking at night. I knew I before the podcast, before the season last year, Tony, I predicted 10-2. Tennessee would split Bama and Georgia. The tape is there forever. And that they would lose at South Carolina. Because I was like, this is going to be a night game. Everything's going to feel great because you got beat. You took down one of the big ones. And South Carolina is just going to be sitting there late. I didn't like when that game was played. I didn't like the situation that it might be for them. And I didn't think it was going to be that bad. But when I say that next day here in Knoxville, Tennessee, felt like a bomb went off. Just it was unlike anything else. I mean, I imagine for South Carolina fans, it was just so euphoric, and on our end, it's like I don't think we'll ever see those orange helmets again. I think those are goners. Those need to go in the trash can forever. Jeremy Banks obviously not available in that one, and that's always going to be a what if he plays with that defense. But
sure.
Hendon Hooker going down, and then he's going to miss out on the Heisman because of that. Like there was just so many things where
On the playoffs, I mean, you know, I I don't know, not just South Carolina. I don't know of another college football team that made a bigger offensive turnaround in 2 weeks than South Carolina did.
Mm,
They went to the swamp and were shut out by a frankly horrendous Florida defense.
yeah.
Shut them out. South Carolina really never scared the end zone in that game. They go to Nashville and win at Vanderbilt in an ugly game the next week, and then just have a complete offensive explosion against Tennessee 2 weeks later that I don't think anyone saw coming. You predicted the win, but I don't think anybody in their right mind could have predicted South Carolina would play offensively the way they did in that game, where Spencer Rattler was just, even his incompletions were perfectly thrown balls for the
Mm.
most part. Either they were thrown away intentionally or they were dropped.
He looked like Aaron Rodgers, like the way he was moving the pocket. It was so crisp. It was a clean ball, and like he was dealing. Like it just. But I will say that some of the revisionist history where it was like that game was over and Hooker went down. I was like, it wasn't like South Carolina was stopping Tennessee all that often. Tennessee was still moving the ball pretty well. Like it wouldn't have surprised me if that game had gone deep into the fourth because Tennessee was moving the football and they were. I wouldn't have predicted them to still come through in the fourth, but it was still enough where I was like,
It was
it wouldn't have shocked me if that game would have been a little tricky late if he doesn't
definitely
go
turned
down.
the momentum at one point, and
Yeah.
you could feel that it could end up being a close game, uh, but South Carolina got the stops they needed in there and capitalized on them, and won it going away, which I don't think anyone saw that coming.
No, Spencer was like, just, oh, is that Brandon Turnage over there? All right, we're gonna go to Brandon Turnage again. Is that Deshaun
Yeah,
Rucker? All right, we're going to Deshaun Rucker again.
and I don't know that I've seen a guy talk more
Oh, come on.
and perform any more poorly than Turnage did in that game. That
Yeah.
was unbelievable to watch.
I turned to my wife. I was like, it's over. Like Turnage and Haddon, like they're talking and they are still. I mean, they're just targeting him over and over again. They saw it and they were like, there's nothing they can do with them. And they just, I don't know. Haddon right now, it looks like he's going to be a starter coming out of spring. So we'll see what he looks like this year. But last thing, we'll get you out of here, Tony. Speaking of Rattler, do you think he has officially turned the corner and that you are going to get some variation of what we saw down the stretch for Rattler, the simplified playbook, being able to play more free, more open, and he has turned the corner? Because I think that ultimately might just be the difference in South Carolina getting to that 8-4, 9-3 mark.
I do think he has turned the corner, but I say it with one caveat. South Carolina has to be able to run the football.
Okay.
And I think right now their obvious weakness on the offensive side of the ball is at running back. They don't have a proven SEC running back that they know they can count on this year. And they're going to play DeCarrion Joyner there. He's played quarterback. He's played receiver. He's an all-purpose type guy. But being an all-purpose guy is different from being an every down running back who has to pass protect and do all the things that running backs have to do. And I think South Carolina has a lot of talent at tight end. I think they're better at tight end this year than they were last year. I think they're as good or better at receiver, but I think they've taken a step back at running back, and that's going to be a big part of how well Rattler can play this year. You have to be able to run the football in the SEC. You can't just throw it 50, 60 times and expect to win week in and week out. You have to have balance. And I think that's the biggest question about South Carolina going into the season is whether they can be as effective as they need to be running it to allow Rattler to because let's face it, play action is a huge part of what Rattler does and why he's effective. He sells it well. He throws a beautiful deep ball, but play action doesn't work very well if you're not running the football. The defense doesn't have to respect it. So that's going to be the biggest key for him and for South Carolina's offense as a whole is to get enough production from the running backs.
There you go. Tony, what can the Gamecocks check out from you and the team over at the Big Spur this week?
Well, huge focus on recruiting right now with they had 6 official visitors in last weekend. Looks like they're going to have somewhere between 7 and 8 this weekend. Camp sessions are going on. So just a lot of great recruiting content on the site right now, and I'm going to continue to be pumping out that side of things. So for anyone out there who might be considering it, be a great time to join the site and get all that recruiting information. And with South Carolina recruiting like they are this year, they're involved with a lot of players at Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama and a lot of big schools that are probably listening to your podcast are going to be following. So it's a chance to get another perspective on where some of those players may be leaning.
Absolutely. And please, I mean, if you don't want Daniel Hill, we're looking for that Peyton Lewis Daniel Hill combination in this class. So if you wanna
They
if you
need it.
wanna cool off there, that I would be okay with it, Tony. I would be okay with it.
Yeah, Tennessee won the battle with Lewis, and South Carolina needs to win the battle with Hill because, like I said, running back is a big question mark, and they need to shore that up for the future.
There you go. Tony, thank you as always for making the time, and we'll have to check back in again soon.
Sounds great. Look forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Well done, nephew. Chase Thomas Podcast. Hell yeah.